And obviously, we are working under constricted conditions, as is all of the country and most of the world right now. Here on the Zero Hour, my next guest is someone you may already be familiar with. He's been on the program before. He joins us at an especially interesting time for, I would say, probably for himself as well as for us. Dr. Abdul El Sayed is he is a public health physician. He is an epidemiologist. He was formerly the health director for the city of Detroit and a candidate for governor in Michigan. He is progressive like ourselves. He has a new book out called Healing Politics, and seems that both those words, healing and politics, are shining with an intensity in our public life like no time in recent history. So without any further ado, Abdul El Sayed, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Zero Hour.
Thank you so much for having me, Richard. I really appreciate it, and I'm sorry to be chatting under challenging circumstances, but I hope that we can clarify some things for folks and make sure folks understand why this is happening and what we can do about it.
Yeah, I think that would be great. And I'd also like to, if we have time, talk a little bit about your book and just a kind of almost philosophical setup here. I'm a great believer in public health, in epidemiology. I did a little bit of work in those areas, mostly health economics. But I'm a great believer that, first of all, that there's great beauty in the underlying philosophy of epidemiology and public health, because it is about our collective well-being as well as our individual well-being. And so I appreciate you, even before the political work, for being in that field. And I feel that this is a moment where the people of the United States and the world need to understand more than ever what it means to care about our public health. And I wonder if you have any thoughts about that to start.
Yeah, no, that's right. The sine qua non of public health is that you have to prevent and that you have to do it together. Public health is about collective action for the public's well-being. Never has that been more imminent and obvious than right now, when we are facing a global pandemic, and the thing that we can do about it is just sit tight and stay home. And if any of us choose not to follow that advice, we make all of us the less healthy for it. And so it really is about collective action for the public good. It's also this moment about what we failed to do early on. Pandemics are like toaster fires. If you put them out when they're in the toaster, then you don't have to put them out when they're in the house. And if you put them out when they're in the house, you don't have to put them out when they're in the neighborhood. And we failed to put it out when it was in the toaster. Our federal government wasn't ready. It has not coordinated the response that is deserving of this moment. And people are dying for it. We saw 1,000 cases as of this time last week, up to 5,000 cases who've died as of yesterday, and those are preventable deaths. They shouldn't have happened. We could have prevented this, and I think it reminds us just how critical our collective action for the public good is, can be, and should have been to preventing this from happening.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that, Abdul Sayed, and I think that always at a moment like the one we find ourselves in now, the three questions are: what can we learn from what just happened? What should we be doing right now? And what should we be thinking about and preparing to do going forward? So maybe just a minute of your thoughts on those three things.
Yeah, let me take number two first. What should we be doing right now? Right now, all of us should be staying home. We should be speaking in the ways that we can, calling and texting and emailing and writing letters to our elected representatives to make sure that we are moving personal protective equipment to the front, pressuring the president to make good on his capacity as the commander in chief and to fulfill the Defense Production Act so that we're getting ventilators online. And we should be listening to our state and local and even federal public health officials because that information can be critical to saving lives. But then what can we learn, which was your first question? Well, we can learn that when we cut the capacities for public health, people suffer. And that's what's happening right now. We've seen a 45% decline in public health funding over the past 15 years. And that's left our state and local health departments playing from behind. And then we've seen proposed funding cuts for the CDC and other federal health agencies, and that has left them without the capacity to do the work that they need to do. And even if a funding cut doesn't actually happen, it still very much shakes the foundation of an agency. And so you can't go threatening people's funding every year and think that they're going to have the ability to think long term when they don't know whether or not the money to do that's going to be there. And then what do we need to be planning for? Well, I think this has shown us that the governing consensus that we've operated under for the past 40 years, which tells us that we can privatize public goods and sell them off for parts to the highest bidder, allowing corporations to make huge amounts of money off of them by excluding the poorest and most vulnerable people, that operating consensus has failed us. It has failed us now, and it has the liability to fail us for what's yet to come. And this global crisis was a pandemic, yes, but there's also a scenario where you see climate change bearing down on us, and even more of these kinds of events happening. And so let's not think that just because we're suffering it now that we're out of the woods. We better decide that as a society we're going to make sure that we're doing what it takes to prevent these things from happening, and that we're going to protect the most vulnerable of us from falling off the slippery edge of our economic and sociologic system that is happening to a lot of folks right now, choosing between saving a life and saving their livelihoods.
I think that's very well said. And Abdul, I want to now talk a little bit about your book, which, I have a lot of friends with books coming out around now. Publication dates are being pushed back, forward, sideways. I'm sure you don't revel in this. Your timing is kind of good.
Well,
And I know you would probably rather it not be so. But one of the things you said is, and I have it in front of me, is our folks would, probably recall that you ran for governor. And one of the things you said was, and I think it's timely, so I'm quoting it, I had thought that I was leaving the epidemiologist in me behind when I chose to become a candidate for office. And maybe you don't mind just elaborating on that for a second. Maybe we can talk about it.
yeah. Well, yeah. It's one never wants to publish a book in the middle of a pandemic. At the same time, though, we talked to our publishers and decided that the information in the book needed to be out there. It needed to be out there right now to both frame the way we think about where we are right now and what we can do once this is all over to make sure that something like this never happens again. And so we decided to go ahead and publish. It came out on Tuesday. I trained as an epidemiologist. I did a PhD in public health, focusing on epidemiology, and I taught epidemiology for a couple of years. And epidemiology is the science that studies the distribution and determinants of disease in populations. Our job is to make patterns out of the world to understand what makes people sick. And when I was running for office, I met people by the hundreds and thousands and got to shake their hands and look in their eyes and see the pressure that hunched their back, the look in their eyes when they furrowed their brow, when they talked about issues that really challenged them. And, I'd been used to making sense out of reams of data on sheets and on computer Excel sheets. But this was meeting my data live in living color and trying to make sense of where we are as a society. And coming out of it, I realized that the challenges that people face, no matter who they are, where they live, are the same. And it is this profound failure to provide very basic goods and services for people, whether that's healthcare, whether that's housing, whether that's a good job that pays a living wage, whether that's quality education that doesn't force you to go into mountains of debt. And those challenges are a function of a failed set of systems that interlock that leave us insecure. And so I diagnosed this epidemic of insecurity in the book, and talk about the kind of politics that I hope can get us out of it.
Yeah, you describe, and again, we're talking with Dr. Abdul El-Sayed, author of the new book, Healing Politics. And you describe, and obviously it's easier said than done, but you use the term, empathy politics. And the idea that, to me, we are literally, by caring for one another, caring for ourselves, and vice versa. But describe for us a little bit your vision of what empathy politics looks like.
Yeah, it's recognizing that all of us are suffering in this moment, even if some of us are turning our suffering into what creates pain for other people. And I think rather than respond in a way that makes turns us into us versus them. We respond in a way that asks, why are you in pain and why are you behaving that way? And I think when you start to see somebody as somebody who's suffering pain and responding to it, it's a lot easier to understand where they're coming from and talk to them in a way that empowers them. And I don't practice medicine, but in medical school, I learned a couple of skills that I think are really important to the work I do now. Number one, it's how to listen to people who are in pain. And number two, it's how to speak truth to people in pain. And you never do it by telling them they're just wrong or by yelling at them, right? When people are in suffering or in pain, yelling at them doesn't make it better. It usually makes it worse. But if you sit down with them and say, look, I hear that you're struggling. I'm sorry that this is happening to you, but what can we do to actually address this? And most people come to a doctor's office thinking that they know what's wrong. But as a doctor, your job is to apply your trade, to take your knowledge and help them to see what's actually wrong by giving them a better understanding of why they're hurt. And I think if we were to apply that same set of skills to our politics, it would fundamentally change the way on the left that we think about and talk to people, and would allow us, I think, to build coalitions in ways that are far longer lasting and far greater, and be able to take on the work that we have to do to build public policy in the way that we know can alleviate some of that pain.
Abdul El-Sayed, I think maybe my favorite thing about your book is, and it's difficult to do, and I think you do it well, is to thread the needle of respect and understanding for minority groups and identity groups that are oppressed in this country with a history of oppression, and at the same time understand that interconnectedness and reaching out in the way you describe is critically important. You mentioned, for example, the deaths of despair among poor working class white men and the increases there, and the fact that we, each of us, exist in a kind of, these aren't your words, but a kind of multi-dimensional state, as you're a Muslim American and so on, you're a person of color, other people have other identities, but that in order to really come together, I think you do a beautiful job of balancing respect for oppressed groups and individuals with the need to come together collectively and improve everyone's lot in life. So maybe in the 2-3 minutes we have left, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I've constantly my whole life been seen as an outsider, though I've always been on the inside. And I say that as an Egyptian American, a Muslim American, whose father is an Egyptian immigrant, and my stepmother, who raised me, is a daughter of the American Revolution. And so I'd spent a lot of my summers in Egypt, where I was seen as the American, and of course here I was always seen as the Egyptian or Muslim kid. And so you learn to see what it feels like to be both on the inside and outside of a space. And so I have a deep empathy for what it means to be otherized, because that was my existence when I was a kid and even now as an adult. But I also have a deep empathy for why sometimes it happens and what we can do to turn potential enemies into allies. And so, as somebody who's spent my whole life translating, what I'm trying to do is sort of see it from both angles and ask, how do we come to an understanding where we really do take on the systems of power, the plutocrats and the corporations that have created a system that that sells us off for their profit. And if we can do that, I think we're all the better for it. And unfortunately, demagoguery is really about division. It's about dividing folks and telling folks who are suffering for different reasons in different ways that the reason they're suffering is one another. And when they can have us pointing fingers at each other, what we're not doing is pointing fingers at the system that has created the circumstances of pain. And so we've got to think beyond that, I believe.
I agree with you absolutely. And a final question for you, Dr. Abdul El-Sayed. Are you, in this present trying moment, optimistic, pessimistic, or wait and see?
I can't do this work without being hopeful, and I'm deeply optimistic, because I know, every morning I wake up and I take a look at my 2-year-old little daughter, and I think about the world that we have to build for her. I think about all the young people that are out there believing in what we can do together if we can only come together. And I believe in the world that they're going to build, and I believe that at our best, we're more than capable of it. So I'm deeply optimistic. This is a hard moment, and And we're gonna be grieving this for some time. People will be lost, and it's awful to think that this was preventable. But I do hope that coming out of this, we learn the lessons of this failure, and we build a world where it's less likely to happen, and if it does, that people are protected from the consequences.
All right. Well, thank you very much for that. Again, we've been talking with Dr. Abdul El-Sayed. He is a public health doctor, epidemiologist, and his new book is Healing Politics. You can find it at healingpoliticsbook.com. And thank you, Abdul El-Sayed, for coming on the program.
Of course. Thank you for taking the time. I really appreciate it.